Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I have another old camera to share with you guys, and it's this camera right here. It's the Canon EOS 50D. Now this camera came out way back in 2008, and even though it's not super long ago, but you know, it's kind of like a classic camera in my opinion, because it still has that kind of classic Canon digital look to it, yet being very capable and reliable to a certain extent as well. And it was also kind of like the last double-digit D camera that Canon kind of kept this, you know, rugged kind of design, whereas, you know, just a generation after this, the 60D was introduced, and yes, it was more hybrid orientated with, you know, fancy video feature for the time and this articulating screen, and it actually took away quite a few features. For example, the command dial up here is actually only one command per button, whereas this, it's actually dual, and it's just also a more posh plastic kind of build quality versus a very tough magnesium alloy, although this is also tough, just plastic. So yeah, there will be a lot of things I'll be discussing based on how I shoot and also based on my personal experience with this camera. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS 50D, now this camera, despite being around 14 to 15 years old, in my opinion, it is still a very capable and reliable camera to use. This camera still is more than capable to really output high quality professional looking images, in my opinion, and to a certain extent you can still use this for your professional work if video is not your requirement, simply because it cannot actually take video, at least without hacking it. So yeah, in this video, as usual, I'll be dividing into 3 different sections. The first one, I'll be talking about the ergonomics, the operational side of things, how it handles and everything, and then leading into the second section, which is the image quality, and then into my conclusion, what I think about this camera, why I still recommend it, and you know, why I don't recommend it to some of you guys. So let's first dive into the first section, which is the ergonomics, the usability of this camera, in my opinion. So this camera, as mentioned earlier, it's built very well, it's built really rugged, and to be honest, I still much prefer this kind of build quality and feeling over the 60D and 70D, because those cameras, even though they feel very comfortable in the hands, but they do feel very plasticky, and you feel the metal, the magnesium alloy material here, and it just makes you feel more secure when you actually want to take it to some sort of harsh environment. And talking about harsh environment, this camera is actually weather sealed, so it's really good. So even when you actually open up the card slots, the battery compartment, you see a rubberized gaskets, and you just really feel like, yeah, it is sealed, and that's actually quite nice. And moving on to the back, you have this really old style, almost square aspect ratio screen, but it is 3 inches, and it is actually pretty detailed, and it looks like it's more or less dominating the back part, which is, you know, not a bad thing. But in the same time, the more modern display is around 3:2 aspect ratio, which would be more convenient to use if you're going to be reviewing images or composing in live view. That being said, this display is absolutely fine. It is still detailed, and it is still more than bright enough to actually view in normal daylight condition. However, in like really super bright sunny kind of environment, or if the sun is directly shining into the screen, or if there's some sort of strong light source or whatever, it will be quite reflective. And it's also very much a fingerprint magnet as well, simply because it is like, it has a very poor coating on it compared to modern day cameras, as well as this is a plastic screen protector, as well as there's also this display gap between the actual protector and the display itself, which actually kind of increases the chance of having that reflective kind of flare if you're actually viewing this screen in such a bright daylight, or if there's a very strong light source directly into the display itself. But otherwise, it's a really nice display. The contrast is really nice, and also the sharpness is also pretty accurate, and the color accuracy, assuming if you're not operating in, let's say, such a bright environment, then it is also accurate as well, which is actually quite nice for such an old display. Moving on to the next point, which is the button layout. Yes, it's very different from both the 40D and the 60D. Well, the 60D is just on its own very different, has a completely redesigned kind of look, but from the 40D you see some of the minor changes on the button at the bottom of the display right here, but also The live view buttons also been kind of relocated, because on the 40D and on many of Canon cameras, the live view button has always been a set button, but on this particular 50D and I think also on the 5D Mark II, they kind of changed it to the button up here. Not I think, they actually changed it to the button up there. So moving on to the next point, which is the frame rate, and as I was actually comparing it to the 40D earlier, this camera is actually shooting a tad slower than the 40D at 6.3 frames per second versus the 6.5 frames per second on the 40D. Now personally for me, that 0.2 frames per second doesn't make that much of a difference, especially if you're just really shooting normal portrait kind of photography or general purpose kind of photography, like basic landscape, basic sports, basic street, basic landscape, cityscape, things like that. So yeah, for those kind of general purposes of photography or general disciplinary photography fields, I think that 6.3 frames per second is still more than enough. Unless if you're really into like baseball and you want to capture that precise moment when the ball hits the bat, then of course go for something like the 1D Mark II, 1D Mark III, 1DX, what have you, because even the 40D will not really be able to capture that precise moment as well as those cameras can. That said, please keep in mind that this camera is actually writing 50% more of the resolution than the 40D into the CF card. And talking about the CF card, this camera, yes, for the storage media, it takes really nice, trusty CF cards. And I really love CF cards because they don't corrupt as easily as SD cards, and it's also harder to lose them. On to the next point, which is the battery. It takes a really iconic BP511 battery, which is this one, and it holds a very long charge, and the A version actually is more efficient than the non-A version when it comes to, you know, distributing electricity into the camera and powering it up and everything. But the BP511 line of battery is actually really reliable, and it's also been really popular as well. Canon has been using this battery ever since the D30 and some digital cameras that came before the D30, and they used it up all the way until 2008 when they actually decided to change to the LPE6 line of batteries. But this battery is still very popular. It is still available brand new in many markets, and even though if Canon doesn't really ship it out anymore, you still can find really reliable third-party brand that actually produces these batteries even today. So you still have really high chance of still, you know, prolonging the life of the 50D or other cameras that you may have that uses the same series of batteries. So yeah, that's actually quite nice as well. And I really love the design on the back as well, that this camera has this joystick, because the 60D doesn't. And to be honest, I really appreciate having this on this camera, and it's not only like fast about, you know, when going through the menu, but it's also fast when you're actually zooming into the images, because you're able to just move around. And just add that with, let's say, this wheel itself, you're just able to really adjust the settings and move through the images really quickly. So yeah, that's actually quite nice. And moving on to the next point, which is the built-in flash. This camera actually has a really nice built-in flash. Listen to it. That was actually the motorized sounding that, you know, not only the motor was raising the flash up, but also the electrical charge inside was actually preparing to fire the flash. So yeah, it's just a really nice kind of sounding in my opinion. The 7D has very similar sounding as well, but yeah, it actually is raising up really high and away from the lens, and this is actually quite good simply because if you're taking pictures of, let's say, portrait in the low light condition, or just taking portraits that are really close to the camera in general, if you want to avoid red eye, having this feature where the flash is actually higher and away from the lens will actually reduces the chance of having that red eye effect, even though you can actually enable the feature to correct for the red eye. But sometimes there will be some sort of red eye creeping into the portraits as well. So if you do like to shoot with flashes, and especially internal built-in flash, then you'll be happy to know that this camera actually eliminates the red eye effect rather quite effectively. So yeah, that's actually quite a nice thing. And also moving on to the next point, which is the shutter speed. The shutter speed on this camera actually goes up to 8,000th of a second. Of course, it's not really something that's important to a lot of people who are shooting, let's say, landscape or cityscapes or long exposure photography. But if you're shooting a lot of portraits, let's say if you're using a lot of the f1.4, f1.8 or even f1.2 lenses out there in the super bright daylight condition, having the 8,000th of a second shutter speed is really useful, and I'm really thankful that Canon didn't cripple this camera by going down to 4,000th of a second like some of their cameras. But on this camera you still have 8,000th of a second, which is really much appreciated. And talking about taking pictures in super bright sunlight, of course you'll need low ISO, and this camera is able to go down to 100 ISO and maxing out at 3200 natively in terms of ISO. So yeah, that's actually still quite nice. This camera takes it further. If you want to expand the ISO, you can actually expand it all the way to 12,800 should you wish to do so. So yeah. And now moving on to the next point, which is the autofocusing system. Now the autofocusing system it's not really exciting. It's only 9 AF points inside, but all of them are cross types, meaning that they're really sensitive to patterns, high contrast area, and also moving subjects. So let's say if you want to photograph some basic sports photography, then this camera is still more than capable to actually, get the job done. And this camera being, having all cross types autofocusing system in here, it also means if you want to focus in, let's say, very complicated pattern kind of scenery, then this camera is still able to do that. Or if you want to photograph in super high contrast environment, then this camera is still able to get the job done as well. Where it will struggle is in low light, like super low light. The AF area will actually hunt a little bit, and it will try to get it correct, but it just will take some time, and sometimes it will actually miss. So just be careful how low light you actually go with this camera. And if you're doing cityscape photography at night, it might actually be better if you actually manually focus it. You still have, the live view feature, and you still can actually magnify in the live view feature, and you can actually fine tune it really nicely, as the screen is actually still rather quite accurate to do the job. So yeah, there is that. But yeah, otherwise this camera is still quite a nice camera in my opinion. And if you want to customize your modes, there are actually 2 customization mode up here as well, the C1 and C2 modes. So you can just save your mode settings in there, and then you can actually go to other modes if you don't need those mode settings. So let's say if you're actually shooting events and it's not really happening constantly, so you can actually save your mode settings and everything on one of those mode dials like C1 or C2. And therefore, if you do ever shoot that kind of event or circumstances again, you can actually go back to those modes. So yeah, that's actually quite nice. And now moving on to the side of the camera, which actually exposes all the ports. This camera actually has all the kind of main ports as you kind of expect from the camera of this era. The USB port, the video out port, which connects the camera to, let's say, your television if you want to show off your images to your family members, your audience, what have you. Your HDMI cable as well if you want to connect it to your monitor and just have a better view of either the images you took or the view of your live view. You can actually do that. And you have your flash sync and remote port. And yeah, it's actually all very essential ports. And now let me actually briefly talk about the metering system on this camera. This camera actually has somewhat of an accurate kind of metering system, so you can actually rely on it for the most part. Of course, in super high contrast situations, you're probably better off at just manually inputting everything yourself, from like the shutter to aperture to ISO and also your white balance and everything. But for general purpose of photography, if you're just like focusing on normal lighting condition, even if you're indoor, the metering system will be able to just judge everything almost accurately to very accurately. So that's actually a very good and positive side as well. And on the last note, this camera actually has a very effective sensor cleaning system. So unlike many of the older DSLRs I actually talk about on my channel, they don't really have, well, actually most of them don't really have sensor cleaning, or at least effective one, but the 50D actually has a very effective sensor cleaning system. So yeah, most of the time you'll find yourself not really having to clean the sensor rather quite often, or at least not really having to delete all the dust from the images quite often as well. So yeah, there's that. And one last point before I go into the image quality, which is tethering. This camera actually allows you to tether the camera with the computer. So if you want to monitor your images or just have your images taken from the camera and saved directly into the computer, you can do that with just, you know, plugging in the USB cable to the computer via the EOS Utility app, and there you can just remote control your camera, and you can even install new picture profile into the camera as well should you wish to do so. And depending on the field of photography that you're actually focusing in, this tool can actually be very useful and effective to use, and it's of course free on Canon website. So yeah. Now into the image quality. Well, the image quality on this camera, it's nothing like you haven't really seen before. It's 15 megapixel effectively, and it is still more than enough if you just want to, let's say, print more than A3 or more than A2, and it will still give you really nice fine print, and it'll still be very sharp, very clear. The color rendition from this camera is really nice, and this camera, you know, it has the older digital look to it because it is still an old digital SLR, so there is this kind of vintage old school look to the sensor that you're getting, well, to the image that you're getting out of the sensor, even though it's not as old school as, let's say, the 20D or the 30D, but you know, some people are still liking the old school look of the 50D. It's somewhat neutral as well, so while being kind of faded and old school, it is also rather quite neutral. So that's actually a very good thing if you want to actually manipulate your images quite a bit. And talking about manipulation, the files you're getting out of this camera is actually quite robust, even though it doesn't have like the most dynamic range in the world. Actually, it has very little amount of dynamic range compared to modern cameras, but you know, if you know its limitations and if you know its capabilities, you're able to actually pretty much work around and yeah, see for yourself which settings will work best, and you know, what settings will actually give you more dynamic range in the field of photography that you're actually focusing in, or in the situations that you're in. So yeah, just take it as what it is. The rendition out of this camera is really nice and smooth. The skin tones out of this camera is also really nice. The color depth is really great as well. The contrast out of the color depth is also pretty good in my opinion. So yeah, overall the color reproduction, the image quality is something that I'm really pleased to say that I'm really happy about from this camera. Of course, you're not going to be shooting this camera in super low light condition. So not only that the autofocusing system won't really perform as well in low lighting situations as, let's say, normal daylight situations or normal lighting conditions, but the image quality will also suffer a little bit in low lighting situations, especially when you use ISO over 1250, for example. And I would say that the sweet spot is don't go over ISO 1000. Even at ISO 800, you will start seeing some noise, but you still can like trade in a little bit of resolution to denoise it a little bit. But if you're really just, you know, wanting to bump the ISO up, I wouldn't recommend over 1250. That being said, if you're really only posting on social media and social network, what have you, then you can just feel free to use, let's say, ISO 1600 and maybe clean up a little bit of noise, because, you know, on those social media platforms in general, you don't need such a detailed image or such a high resolution image. Therefore, you can just trade in some of the resolution for denoising as well. So yeah, it is still quite practical. It is still quite nice, but just be careful on the scenarios or the conditions you're actually photographing in. That being said, of course, if you're photographing long exposure, it still is able to maintain a lot of detail from long exposure, so that's a good news. And you are still able to actually recover a lot of highlights from long exposure images as well with this camera. So yeah, that's really a great benefit to this camera as well. Oh, and just going off topic just a little bit, since this camera is a crop sensor camera, you can actually mount EFS lenses on this camera as well, and it will actually open up many more perspectives that you can actually experiment with versus just only using EF lenses. But if you want to use EF lenses with this camera, even though it's much bigger, much heavier, generally speaking, unless if you're using like, let's say the 50mm, which is actually quite light, but generally speaking, let's say the EF 70 to 200 f2.8, which is this one, you still can mount it on this camera and it will still be quite balanced. And now back into the image quality, and one last thing that I would like to actually mention is When photographing in areas where there are lots of complex patterns, please be careful of, let's say, moire and aliasing, simply because this camera, well, actually many of the older DSLRs in general, they don't deal well with moire and aliasing. So when you do photograph in these kind of situations where you have areas with a lot of complex patterns, especially with a lot of fine lines and everything, then moire and aliasing can actually start creeping in a little bit. And of course, when you know the limitations of this camera to a certain extent, when the moire would start creeping in, you can always work around it, of course. But yeah, if you're actually working a lot with, let's say, fine detail, fine patterns, especially certain type of fabrics, let's say, or if you're working a lot with architecture and there are a lot of very fine patterns in the bricks, then you will have to be very careful when using this camera or any kind of older DSLRs in general, because again, they don't deal well with those situations. But otherwise, this camera, as mentioned earlier, the color rendition, the color reproduction, the dynamic range. Well, the dynamic range is not great, but you still can work around it. But all the other color reproduction and rendition is actually really nice and really neutral, but also kind of very smooth in a very nice way, if that makes sense. So yeah, it is definitely a camera to try out, even just for the color look of it. And now over into the conclusion. So yeah, this camera overall is still a good camera in my opinion, and it's the camera that I'm still recommending to a lot of people and to a lot of you guys out there as well, who just want to get started with photography and want somewhat like a reliable camera, and also a camera that is very tough, rugged, and has basic weather sealing to it. And of course, having a weather sealed camera, not only that it allows you to, you know, go into harsh condition environments, but in order to actually make it completely weather sealed, make sure to actually mount a weather sealed lens onto the camera as well. So that's how the rain drops or the dust or the sand won't actually get into the camera from the side. So just keep that in mind. But otherwise, yeah, I think for most cases, this camera will just get the job done really nicely. 15 megapixel is actually not all that low. Of course, you actually have a lot of smartphones out there that actually shoots, let's say, 108 megapixels or 48 megapixels, things like that. But the quality of the pixel of this camera is actually pretty good. And for the fact that you can actually shoot in RAW, you can actually recover a lot from the images, as well as manipulate a lot in the images as well later on in post. And being from an old sensor, it also means that the file won't really be, you know, requiring a lot of energy from your computer itself. So that's also another positive thing about this camera. And then just an overall feeling of this camera, how it grips, how it operates, it's just very efficient. It feels very nice and rugged in your hands, and it just, yeah, it just brings a lot of confidence when you're actually shooting. And if you do have heavier lenses on here, it actually balances out really nicely as well. So it's a really good kind of system, and it's also very efficient, and it is really fast as well. So if you just power it up and then focus, 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 it actually is, you know, it is really responsive, and I cannot really recommend it enough that this camera, it's just about 100 euros, but it is already, you know, bringing a lot of capability onto the table. That being said, being an old camera, it does have its own kind of inconvenient disadvantages from modern cameras. So it doesn't have Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, NFC, what have you. So you have to actually manually, you know, put the card out and actually plug it into your computer, or at least your card reader, and then your card reader into your computer, and then just download the image from there, and then just add it from there or transfer it to your phone. Whereas with more modern cameras, you can actually just, you know, connect the camera to the phone, and you can actually monitor the camera or remote control the camera as well to see what the camera is seeing just from your phone. It's actually a more convenient tool to have as well. But, you know, if you don't need that, then it's totally okay. This camera, at its core, it's a very nice photography camera first. And, you know, the good thing about that is just you're not going to be distracted with all the like weird gimmick and features, because, you know, you still just have your basic controls, your core controls at your fingertips. You can just control your shutter, your ISO, your aperture just with your fingertips, and you don't really need to take your eye off the viewfinder, which is really nice. So when you have a camera that it actually just strips down to the basics and just allows you to focus on the core of photography, it actually brings another way of thinking to photography. So rather than capturing the images based on the feature sets of your camera, let's say, you know, my camera has this feature, has that feature, therefore can actually take this kind of images, that kind of images. But you know, with this camera, you can just actually just focus on what's happening around you, what's happening in front of you, focus on your creation, focus on the story, what you're actually capturing. And yeah, this camera will not just really be in the way with its feature. It will not really be distracting. So, you know, it's a really nice core photography first camera, and that's what I really love about this camera, especially for the price point. It is, again, really rugged, reliable, and durable. So you can just take it to many places and it will actually survive. And at the end of the day, if you don't like the camera, you can always still sell it at roughly the same value that you actually got it, because the value is actually not really going to decrease that much more than this. And especially if you bought it secondhand, you can pretty much always sell it at the same price or even higher sometimes. So yeah, overall, I'm still recommending this camera to most of you. Again, if you need high ISO or if you need to photograph in like, you know, super fast environment or super low light environment, then this camera might not always be for you in that field. But otherwise, it is a very nice camera to have in general, and also just to take general photography purposes. So yeah. But that's just pretty much my opinion and just my experience on using this camera. Take it as a grain of salt. I hope it actually helps some of you guys out, if not a lot, then a little. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free for beginners on my website. The link is down in the description section below. It's absolutely for free. Just click and download. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching and for sticking in this video this long. Salute to all of you who actually managed to actually stay this long, as I tend to actually talk really long. But yeah, otherwise, thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.